Hello, listeners. Today is Wednesday, January 15th. Welcome to Behind the Numbers, Reimagining Retail, an EMARKETER podcast. This is the show where we talk about how retail collides with every part of our lives. I'm your host, Sara Lebow. Today's episode is Lessons from the 2024 holiday season. It's going to be our last talk about these, or the holidays, for a little bit, so we're going to make it count. Before we get into that, here are the guests for today's episode. Joining me first up is Rachel Wolff. Hey, Rachel.
Hey there.
Also with us is Zach Stambor. Hey, Zach.
Hey, guys.
Both joining from very cold places, New York and Chicago right now. And I am also joining from a very cold New York, so everyone's just bundled on this.
Got our flannel.
Yeah. All right, let's learn some lessons from the 2024 holiday shopping season. When we last checked in on this season, Black Friday had just happened, holiday spend was relatively healthy, and we were eyeing a very short and very funky December holiday season. Now it's January. I still haven't made my returns of the thing I bought that didn't fit me on Black Friday, and it's probably too late now. But before we go down that hill, I want to know, did anything change, anything unexpected happen as it relates to what our holiday predictions were?
Yeah, there were a few interesting trends that I saw that I'm not sure that I expected. One was, if you look at the year-over-year growth, there were two very strong periods. One, the week before Black Friday, so the week before Cyber Week, had very strong growth. We saw a lot of retailers launch sales that week. I dubbed it the Cyber Dozen because the sales launched like the Thursday before Thanksgiving. And so there was like a real 12-day period of pretty steep discounts. So we saw that period. And then we saw another strong growth period the week after the Cyber Week, which I think is a reflection of the very short window between Thanksgiving and Christmas, because as soon as Thanksgiving was over, it was basically December, and people were like, uh-oh, I've got to buy stuff now to ensure that it gets to my door so I can give it on Christmas or Hanukkah.
Yeah, you didn't have that extra week of padding, like where December sneaks up on
I know
you.
that certainly happened for me. I was like, uh-oh, I've got to start buying some stuff.
I think from my perspective, the broader trend lines were pretty much what we saw with Cyber Week. I mean, you had e-commerce sales growing pretty strongly. Adobe said, it was a record 8.7% growth to $241.1 billion. And in terms of growth, it's actually pretty close to what we forecast, which was around 9%. So that's just something to call out.
Yeah, good work to our forecasting team.
One other thing that I saw was this growing divide between higher and lower and middle income consumers. And you kind of saw it manifest in several different ways. One is just consumer sentiment. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment really showed that higher income consumers are far more positive about how things are going than lower and middle income consumers. You saw it at retail stores when like retailers like Williams-Sonoma were pretty bullish about how things went and were going, and they didn't need to lean too heavily on promotions. And then at the same time, you saw the Dollar Trees and Dollar Generals of the world say that their shoppers are spending pretty cautiously. Even manufacturers, this was a phenomenon where like Newell Brands, which makes like Graco strollers and Oster kitchen appliances, they saw like the high-end blenders that are like $100 or $100 plus, those were selling really well. But the cheaper ones, the like $20 ones, just had pretty sluggish sales. So there really is a growing divide between people who feel pretty good, are spending, they're going out to eat, and those who are pinching pennies.
Yeah, it's interesting you say going out to eat because restaurant spending was up too during the season also, right?
Yeah, it was up 6.3%, which is pretty strong. And there has been, some inflation. You go out to eat and you get your bill and you're little surprised at how much it was, but still 6.3% is not nothing. And it's a sign that at least some consumers, probably these higher income consumers, feel pretty decent about spending on something that is purely discretionary.
Yeah, higher income consumers being confident as lower income consumers are not feels like the theme of all of Q4 last year. So I'm not at all surprised. I feel like it bled into all news that we heard about everything in Q4, and it makes sense that it was thematic during the holidays.
Totally.
Zach, last year you mentioned the election as a big factor in this holiday season. Did that change things? I mean, obviously we can't know what would have happened either way, but do you feel like it had an impact?
Yes and no. Yes, it had an impact. No, not in the way that I expected. So what was surprising was the election. We knew the results of the election much sooner than I thought we would. I thought there was going to be a lot of stuff going on that was just going to distract people for quite some time after Election Day. But lo and behold, we knew the results on election night. But once we knew those results, that's when there was an effect because Trump won. And once Trump won, people started paying attention to his economic agenda, and they started to get worried about inflation again. And they started spending because they figured, I might as well buy the car today before tariffs drive up the price. I might as well buy the TV today. I might as well buy appliances. And so they spent on these big ticket items that, like, in other circumstances, they might have held off.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think on the one hand, yes, you do have people who are doom spending who, to get ahead of potential tariffs and higher prices this year. But there's also a segment that's just more confident. They see the economy heading in a more positive direction now that Trump is president. And I think that may have also unlocked additional spending during the holiday season.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it true that like the number one indicator of how people feel about the economy is whether or not the party they support is in office? So that might be anecdotal. I think that might be true, though.
No, it's true. It's true. It's supported by evidence.
So it makes sense that there would be, at like a minimum, a shift where a bunch of people maybe are pulling back, but a bunch of people are spending. And even the ones who might be pulling back, they're probably the ones that are paying the most attention to those tariffs and making sure that they get the spending in before tariffs set in.
Right. And, they're buying not just big ticket items, but toilet paper, household essentials, like all of these things that they're stockpiling just in anticipation of what will come next.
Yeah, stockpiling toilet paper hasn't historically worked, so hopefully people aren't doing that again. Something I did mention at the start of the show is that I have not made my returns from Black Friday. What's happening with returns? It sounds like this is a pretty crazy return season this January.
It is. Salesforce reports a 28% jump year over year.
That's crazy because a year ago on this podcast, we were talking about how high returns are. And so if we're up more than 25% from that, I mean, this is going to become a problem if it isn't already for retailers.
I wonder how much of that is because it was a shorter holiday season, right? So people are just buying up, whatever they think they'll need. And then, you're just making a decision later on to send back what you don't want. So I think that just might be, a lingering effect.
I think that's right. I think it's the growth of e-commerce is one factor. And in line with that, the growth of showrooming and people just being like, okay, well, I don't know if I'm an 8, a 10, or a 12, so I'm just going to buy them all and see what works.
Yeah.
And then eventually, hopefully, you do return it. And it's not just sitting in your bedroom. Like, I have a whole lot of stuff in my bedroom I need to return. But apparently a lot of people did not take their time. They rushed to the store or to the post office or whatnot to return it.
Yeah, we've talked about returns on the pod before. I'm sure we'll do it again. But the 8, 10, or 12 conversation also has to do with all retailer sizing is sort of bogus right now. None of it is consistent. And there's been a move sort of away from softer clothing toward harder return to office clothing, hard pants as we call them, which is harder to size. So I think that also is driving up returns.
That's so true. I was just buying a pair of shoes and the range of shoe sizes that fit me was all over the map. It was like a full size and a half span.
Yeah.
And it's just frustrating.
I am a loyal Adidas customer for shoes, not because I think their shoes are inherently better or like even spectacular, but because I know my size in Adidas sneakers. And even though I'm mostly not an e-commerce consumer, once my sneakers get holes in them, I just want a new pair. And that's the only reason.
Yeah, but it does kind of force you to engage in this behavior because otherwise you're just going back and forth and back and forth. And that's a really bad experience too.
Okay, before we get too off topic with my not amazing e-commerce habits, what is the biggest takeaway from this holiday season from each of you? Rachel, why don't you go first?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just that customers are deal conscious, and it looks like they're going to be that way for some time, especially now with all this uncertainty over what tariffs will mean for everything from grocery prices to car prices.
Zach?
Yeah, so on the surface, I think this looks like a solid close to a solid year. But if you look a little bit closer, you see a growing split in the haves and have-nots within retailers. I mean, just in the final days of the holiday season, you saw both Container Store and Party City file for bankruptcy protection. You saw Nordstrom go private to avoid
Which Susie
the glare.
accurately predicted on this podcast. Good work, Susie.
Good work. It also wasn't fully unexpected, but, they did want to avoid the glare of the public markets. And so, some retailers are doing quite well, but it's not the rising tide lifts all boats. It really is a more nuanced situation than that.
Yeah, it sounds like the haves and have-nots are really maybe going to be the water we're all swimming in as we enter this new year. Okay, now that we've discussed the 2024 holiday season, I want to make you guys predict things that you can't possibly predict. So I have asked you each to come with an outrageously early prediction for the 2025 holiday season. To reiterate, it is January 15th. You cannot possibly know what will happen, but we know what's going on this year, kind of. I mean, already we're in sort of a year of chaos, so maybe the prediction is just chaos, but I want to hear your outrageously early predictions for next holiday season. Zach, what is your 2025 holiday season prediction?
So I think we will see inflation this year pick up. I think Trump's economic policies, however they actually manifest, will lead to inflation. I think it'll lead to a somewhat lackluster holiday season. Sales might look strong because of inflation, but actual results will be kind of flat to down in terms of real numbers.
So sort of the opposite of what happened this year.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
We just talked about how, the best indicator of how you feel about the economy is if your party is in office or not. Do you think that consumer confidence will actually drop with Trump, or do you think that people who support Trump will feel the confidence of seeing him back in office?
I think it kind of depends on what unfolds, and so much is uncertain. We really have no idea. I mean, it's a very uncertain world.
Comes back to the most predictable thing about Trump being that he's unpredictable.
Absolutely. So one thing that could give consumers some confidence, or at least some segment of consumers' confidence, is if the tax bill passes and consumers feel like, hey, I'm going to have some more money in my pocket so I can spend that money. Last time around, that was very heavily weighted toward the more affluent. So we might just see a further divide in terms of the haves and have-nots. Although a lot of people felt good about the Trump tax cuts, even if it didn't actually result in them getting a big benefit from it.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense, but it sounds like a sound prediction to me. Rachel, what is your prediction?
So my prediction is that Gen AI shopping assistants and chatbots are going to play a much larger role in holiday sales this year. It still feels weird to say this year. My instinct is to say next year. I know we're in 2025. But we saw, at least according to Salesforce, a pretty sizable number of people are already using Gen AI in some way in their shopping journey, whether it's just to, help with product discovery or product research or finding deals or even just using AI customer service. But I think that this year people will be a lot more intentional about using it for those purposes.
Well, and I think it's going to grow whether they intend to or not, because it's just there. And I think a lot of the data that we've seen is that people don't even know that they're using it, but they happen to be using it and it's delivering some sort of benefit. So I think it's a surefire prediction that will come true.
I can say with like pretty much certainty that if I were not a retail analyst, I would not notice that a chatbot is what's like delivering me my results. Like, I think I would just think I was getting results and not really think about it. The only lens from which I think about this is from my like analytical lens. And if I didn't have that on, I'd just be like, you type things in, a result happens. The result might have changed formats, but I wouldn't register it as Gen AI.
And that's totally fine. Like, you don't need to know what's behind the technology.
Well, I do. But
right. But the average consumer does not need to know why what they're using works in the way that it does. They just need to know that it delivers the results that they're seeking.
Yeah, I mean, our search behaviors, like I'm going to get ahead of myself on Gen AI search, but our search behaviors have completely changed over the past 10 years, even from like Boolean search terms to like plain text search. And so it makes sense that this evolution will just keep happening without us realizing and will specifically happen in retail. Okay, well, that is all we have time for today. Thank you to our listeners and to our podcast team who edits the podcast. We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode of Reimagining Retail, an eMarketer podcast. And Friday, join Marcus for another episode of Behind the Numbers, an eMarketer podcast.